Chapter 8. Night of the Kettle Dance. That night the brigade camped at the head of the Longsow. Though Pierre was glad to have those tough portages behind him, he was nervous when Charbonneau bragged about how far would paddle the next day. Tomorrow we hit a sweet stretch of river, not a single shoal or rapids to slow us down. We cover 40 miles easy. That meant steady paddling with his blistered hands. As they carried the packs up to the campsite, Pierre asked Emile, "Can you really paddle that far in one day?" "Charbonneau starts fast," Emile said with a smile, tugging at his curly sideburns, "and once we hit the big water, he'll go even faster." He looked at Pierre's hands. "How they holding up?" Pierre shrugged. He didn't want to admit that his fingers were too sore to straighten. While the light was still strong, Pierre helped Emile gum the canoe and fix the watape, the cedar root lacing on the canoe seams that had frayed during their upstream drags. Every canoe carried spare watape and pine gum, as well as a rolled sheet of birch bark for repairing leaks and tears. Later, Pierre wandered down to the shore and looked north. Above the horizon rose the forbidding, glacier-scored hills of the Canadian Shield. "So what do you think of her?" Lalonde asked. He relaxed on a nearby log. "It looks like tough country." "Tough and wild," Lalonde agreed. "That ridge will lie to the north for our whole trip to Grand Portage." Pierre nodded. His father had told him of the famous outcroppings known as the Laurentine Hills. They marked the point where the rivers started flowing north to Hudson Bay. When the first explorers came searching for a trade route to China, that highland crushed their hopes. But to us, it's home. "Home?" Pierre questioned, staring at the cold hills. Lalonde laughed at Pierre's frown. "I remember the first night I camped here. I was scared stiff. A 14-year-old short hair away from home for the very first time. I sat down on that ledge right over there and bawled my eyes out." Pierre frowned. He wondered if Lalonde was making up a story to make him feel better. "It's true," Lalonde insisted, seeing the doubt in Pierre's eyes. "That spring my old man booted me out of the house. One day he said, 'Time you got out and made something of yourself.' Next thing you know, my papers were signed and I was paddling north." "Your father never asked if you wanted to sign on?" "No," Lalonde laughed at Pierre's astonishment. "He was a storekeeper and 9 kids were too many to feed. So out I went. Just like that." "There's no need to feel sorry for me," he said, patting Pierre gently on the shoulder. "I headed north that year and I never did go back. In a season, I fell in love with this life. Wouldn't trade it for anything now. Besides," Lalonde smiled, as he stood and waved a hand in the direction of the men who were clustered around the campfire, "who could ever ask for a nicer family than those fellows?" Alone, Pierre watched the sun disappear in pink and purple trails. Cold crept down from the darkening hills, and steam rose off the water. A blackbird called upriver. Pierre thought of his mother back home in Lachine. She would be warming a pot of tea on the wood stove about now. From the time he was a little boy, he'd taken a cup of tea with his parents before he went to bed. When he was small, the tea was mostly milk, but it made him feel like a grown-up. Later, there was a book or a story before they tucked him in for the night. When Pierre walked back to camp, he found Gard at the fire, preparing the evening's feast. The big cooking pot, filled with water, pork fat, and corn, was propped between 2 flat rocks and just beginning to steam. The air was heavy with smoke. Gard knelt, whistling, making quick work of the duck. He tossed feathers in all directions. Pierre smiled when he imagined what his mother would think of the cook's crude technique. It was hard for Pierre not to stare at the cook's scarred face. Gard was a thin man with greasy hair and small, close-set eyes. He was the oldest man in the brigade, and according to La Petite, the most experienced, having traveled down the Fraser River to Canada's western coast. His work as a cook was a step towards retirement. "Is it true," Pierre asked, "that you've canoed to Athabasca?" "It is," Gard replied. never taking his eyes off the duck. And true that I've paddled all the way to the Pacific, and true that I've spent many a winter with nothing but a trading gun to bring down my supper. You wintered that far west? I've traveled twice to New Caledonia, and I've married 8 good wives, too. I surely haven't wasted my whole life with pork-eaters such as these, he said, jerking his head and spitting into the fire. Men who went farther north than Grand Portage were sometimes called pork-eaters, out of scorn. I've seen sights that turn your blood cold, he stated, as he laid the duck across a log, sawed off its head and feet with his hunting knife. Next, Gard crouched before the fire and passed the bird back and forth through the flames a few times to singe off the pin feathers. Then, in a voice loud enough for half the camp to hear, he announced, "Now to flavor our soup." To Pierre's horror, Gard tossed the blackened carcass, entrails and all, into the cooking pot. Pierre coughed, and the cook turned with a grin. "What's this, young man? Is my butchery not fancy enough for you?" "So, Gard," Charbonneau interrupted from the far side of the fire, "which one of your wives taught you such a recipe for duck? I bet she was old and blind." A chorus of laughs rose around the fire. "She was lots prettier than you fellows," Gard scoffed, "and she could see plenty good." Pierre stared at Gard, wondering what else he planned to throw into his kettle. Jean Beloit was sitting on a flat rock, teased Pierre. "You never want to waste the guts, boy. That's the tastiest part." Beloit saw Pierre's grimace, so he pushed it one step further. "Just ask the Sioux. Those fellows love the innards. After a buffalo kill, they'll fight for the first bite of raw liver. Same with intestines. I've seen braves chew their way through a gut pile like kids at a taffy pull." Wide-eyed, he raked his hands through the imaginary mounds of entrails. "There's hundreds of feet," he continued, "and it stretches so far that a man can start at either end and—" When Pierre jumped up, Beloit feigned surprise. "What's wrong?" As Pierre knelt behind a big balsam tree and emptied his stomach, he could hear Beloit bragging, "I think something make little grandpa sick." Pierre hated that stupid cackling voice. He heard Lalonde stick up for him. "What you do to the poor boy? Let him look at you? That'll make anybody sick." Pierre felt ashamed. As bad as the nickname Grandpa was, poor boy was even worse. Later, when the men gathered around the kettle to fill their plates, Pierre walked back towards the fire. McKay took his place at the head of the line, and the other crewmen fell in behind him. Though Pierre didn't feel like eating, he knew he could never endure 40 miles of upstream paddling tomorrow without food. It was a mystery to him how that these men could work so hard, living on only 2 meals and pipe smoke. He took a place near the end of the line, trying to draw as little attention to himself as possible. When his turn finally came, Gard ladled a big pile of soupy corn onto his plate. Just when it looked as if Pierre would be left to eat in peace, Beloit crowed, "I see why they call this one Grandpa. He wiser than his years. How many young fellows be smart enough to know the best comes last? It's a clever fellow who waits until the pot is almost empty and the duck parts are settled to the bottom." Pierre just smiled and set down his food without looking at it. "Here," he said to Gard, "let me help. It's not fair that the cook always has to eat last." Astonished by such unexpected consideration, Gard accepted Pierre's offer. As Pierre loaded up Gard's plate, the proud cook turned towards the fire, declaring to anyone who would listen, "Finally, we have a man among us who knows how to treat Andre." Pierre served the rest of the men. When it was Beloit's turn, he pointed to the boy's ladle. "Look," he said, "our little lady friend has found a tool he can handle." Pierre's ears burned, but he said nothing. Beloit laughed his way to a seat on a rock next to Lalonde and began eating. Pierre watched Beloit as he served the last men. It took him longer to eat than the others because he talked the whole time. Bits of food fell into his lap or got caught in his beard, but he didn't care. Just when Pierre was convinced that Beloit would never finish his meal, The men took a big scoop from his borrowed plate, saying, "This is what I call corn soup. Tastes like poetry, doesn't it?" "Look who's talking," Charbonneau said. "You wouldn't know a poem from a pack sack." Beloit shoveled the heaping spoonful in and bit down hard, but suddenly he was spitting the food onto the ground. "Ack!" he groaned, hacking and spitting a second time. "What's the matter?" Lalande asked. "Can't you stomach the elegant meat?" The rest of the crew turned to see what had caused the commotion. Beloit searched the ground frantically. A moment later he paused and slowly held up the bright orange foot of a duck. "Who's had his hands in the cooking pot?" Several men grinned, but no one said anything. "I'll have his ears, I will," Beloit said. As he spoke, he fingered the hilt of the knife that hung at his waist. Pierre could no longer contain himself and burst into a peal of laughter. Beloit rubbed his eyes and squinted. "You!" The whole company joined in Pierre's laughter. Lalande, his white hair shaking, clapped Beloit on the shoulder, saying, "That's one on you, Hivernet." Beloit glared across the fire, still touching the bone handle of his knife. Pierre imagined what his ears would look like floating in the cooking pot. "What's the matter, Jean?" Charbonneau called. "I've heard the Sioux regard duck's feet as a rare delicacy." That was enough to bring a half-smile to Beloit's face. As he grinned, he tossed the webbed foot towards Pierre, saying, "You, such a good cook's helper, I share it with you." "Thank you, sir," Pierre said in a mock politeness as the foot rolled to the edge of the fire, "but I've had my fill." When Beloit laughed again, Pierre knew he was safe, but his heart was racing as if he'd run a long way. What would he have done if the evil man had unsheathed his knife? He finally sat down to eat. The corn and duck and salt pork were delicious, sweetened by his revenge. Pierre was ready for bed. He needed rest if he wanted to survive the next day's paddling with his aching arms and blistered hands. But just as Pierre was reaching for his blanket, La Petite shouted, "It's time for the kettle dance!" And there was a great commotion throughout the camp. Without another word, kegs were opened and 2 sacks were placed beside the fire. La Petite, as a senior member of the brigade, stood on one sack, while Emile Duval stood on the other. Each held a kettle under his arm. Pierre watched Emile, dressed in deerskin leggings, a long shirt, a sash, and a feathered cap, begin prancing in a half circle and singing, "We leave, good hearts, our loves behind, for a parting to span 3 seasons. But voyagers born, we journey to live and spit in the face of danger." Duval paused then, and the rest of the crew took up the rousing chorus. "We start the bold traverse today. Away, brave friends, away. For the safety of our company, pray. Away, brave friends, away." La Petite stepped forward, dressed in a blue cloak and red sash, carrying a beaded bag. He moved about slowly and sang in a big, sweet voice, "Dark with our nights be and cold our couches. The devil by day will seize our blades over portages long, and sots and streams. With death-stalked hearts we sing." The crew joined in as before, and the singers went on, taking turns for the next 7 verses. The men laughed and clapped, and at the end of each verse, at least one man shrieked. Pierre, trying to shake the sleep from his eyes, studied the cavorting men and thought back over the hard upstream haul they'd made that day. Where does all their energy come from? He wondered, admiring Lalande's high-kicking style. When Pierre was too tired to watch any longer, he rolled out his blanket under a canoe. The voices soon faded as he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep.